how many more businesses have to be set on fire, how much more looting needs to happen, and how many more people need to be injured and journalists targeted and beaten for us to even get to discussion, hey, there's a problem. And my frustration is this is always getting back to, at least in discussions with liberals or those who are on the center left, is, well, basically, who's more bad than who? And can we just
But
admit that there's an issue of political violence in the US?
Andy No, thank you for being with us on Times Radio. Um, for those people who are not sort of familiar with you and your work, could you give us the sort of potted history of that moment, perhaps, Andy, that you really came to people's attention in America in particular after the events in Portland?
Well, I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, in the western part of the United States, and that city has a reputation long for being very progressive, very left-wing. And as a student journalist in 2016, I was an editor at the student newspaper at Portland State University. I witnessed how that progressivism turned towards something much darker and violent and disturbing. And the protesters in Portland, a crowd size of thousands, could not accept the 2016 election win of Trump, and they rioted. And at that time, I had an iPhone 7, and I was documenting what I witnessed in downtown Portland, of my city, which were large groups of people dressed head to toe in black with their faces covered. This is 4 years before COVID, mind you, and working in a coordinated fashion, destroying street by street, moving together, starting fires. And I had no idea what those people were or what they were organizing for. But the way that the local media covered it in the following days after that riot, 3 days of rioting, was that this was a reaction to a fear of racism and fascism because of the incoming Trump administration.
Mm.
And that the type of violence I witnessed that night did not seem to be rooted in any type of protest against racism. It was anarchy and violence for the purpose of violence. So for the next 4 years, I continued going out to record the riots that became quite entrenched in Portland, and brawls between the left and right. And I learned pretty soon on that these people who are dressed in black and committing acts of political violence called themselves Antifa. They claimed to be anti-fascist. And I wanted to investigate what they were. So 9 years of my journalism career has been dedicated to exploring this ideological movement and how it manifests in the
Mm.
United States and also globally.
Yes. Okay. And that's kind of a central pillar, as you say, of your work. And you've got you've had a book out about that, and have talked to the president about that in the last couple of weeks, and we'll talk about that specifically in more detail in a moment. The idea that you present, Andy, is that Antifa, far from being a sort of disorganized idea, is much more of a organized, structured organization, I guess. And that's the conflict bit, isn't it? You say that, others say the challenge to you is it is not. It is a sort of widespread group of sort of organizations, group of activists, no central leader, no central sort of governance.
I've always maintained in the beginning that this is not a singular organization. It's very clear that how it functions is it's decentralized networks, and how the level of involvement can vary a lot from an individual, and the organization can vary a lot. I would argue that the Antifa's movement operates on deception. They want the public and law enforcement to believe that they are not organized, but they are. You don't get groups of people together and flyers out for events as they did in 2020, and telling individuals what riot weapons and what clothing to bring and exactly where to show up and train without some level of organization. And there, I think maybe how people can better understand Antifa is to make a comparison to radical Islam, in that you can have it simply as an ideology that stops there, or you can have that ideology manifest in very organized militant groups that are international, or individuals who consume the radical propaganda that's put online and become a so-called lone wolf militant. And we see that same type of phenomenon manifest through this movement that calls itself Antifa.
And I guess the thing that I'm sort of grappling with, Andy, is that isn't necessarily new. If we consider Antifa, anti-fascists as being a sort of an idea, around that idea builds lots of different groups, some of them with different objectives, different aims, and also different methods. And within that, you're going to find people who are committing violence, people who are doing things that are beyond the pale, and you'll also find people who are, sort of protesting something they believe in within the law. What we're presenting here isn't necessarily that new.
What? No, it's decades old. That's my point, and they've been well
But even
trained
but I
in.
mean I mean the sort of principle of there being lots of decentralized organizations, lots of people of different sorts of facets around a central idea.
Okay, I'm not disagreeing with you there. I argue in my book that the ideology goes back decades in the current manifestation, particularly to the 80s. I do want to draw a distinction, though, that the contemporary manifestation of so-called Antifa is not a direct linkage to the original Antifa, which was a communist paramilitary during the Weimar Republic in Germany. So its ideological, spiritual origins, you could argue, were communist. And during the Weimar Republic, the Antifa there were involved in very violent street brawls with not just fascists, which people know about, but also against the Social Democrats. So there's two different things, and what we are seeing that's new about Antifa, though, particularly in the United States, are those who are carrying out murders or attempted murders based on this ideology. There's been a number of killings in the U.S., particularly in 2019. There was a gunman who sent out a manifesto in Washington State describing himself as Antifa, citing the lyrics of Bella Ciao, which, by the way, were recently referenced on one of the rifle cartridges used in the Charlie Cook assassination. He carried out a attempted bombing and shooting of a ICE facility in Tacoma and died in a shootout with law enforcement. Then in 2020, during the riots, this is when I was undercover in Portland, there was a Trump supporter in downtown who was assassinated by a man who left behind a manifesto on Instagram, and his quote was, "I'm 100% Antifa." And just last week, the Department of Justice in the Northern District of Texas announced that two individuals accused of being part of a North Texas Antifa cell in a terror plot where a officer was shot in the neck in close to Dallas, that they have been federally indicted for providing material support for terrorism. So
Okay.
what I just described to you, that those things are new.
Okay. Um, okay. One of I suppose we're talking here about the idea of prescription as well, right? There's this been sort of big debate around whether or not an organization like Antifa, or the idea of Antifa, or however you want to describe it, could be prescribed as a terrorist organization. And that becomes a challenge, doesn't it, when you consider it as lots of different entities in comparison to something maybe a story you're familiar with here in the United Kingdom, which is Palestine Action, an organization who have a clear structure where it's a lot easier to prescribe. That's been controversial sort of across the piece. How do you go about arguing in favor, or how do those people who are sort of in favor of it argue that it's possible to prescribe a group like Antifa?
So in the United States, because of the First Amendment, there is no legal ability for a domestic extremist organization to be proscribed, which is actually a surprise to a lot of people internationally. They think that in the US, for example, that being part of an extremist group could be banned legally, but it cannot. That's why we have in the US violent neo-Nazi groups that exist, the KKK exists, and violent far-left extremist groups exist as well. The proscribing framework is in the United States exists entirely in the post 9/11 context, where there has to be an international angle. So what people have to understand is that the original announcement weeks ago by President Trump and then the executive orders don't talk about prescribing ideology because that cannot be done in the US. In fact, if you read the two executive orders related to Antifa, it's talking about specifically dismantling networks of violent uh, anarchist extremists, revolutionaries, anti-government extremists who engage in criminal conspiracies. And there was a directive to the Department of Justice to specifically pursue looking at the terrorism support angles to some of these groups, which doesn't have anything to do with banning the groups. With that being said, I did say at the White House 2 weeks ago that the State Department should look at perhaps how the international arms of Antifa work and coordinate and provide funding to some of the American Antifa groups. Because
Okay.
in that regard, the State Department can proscribe the international Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization, FTO.
Okay. And that sort of brings us, I guess, to accusations of a direct hypocrisy so far as the current Trump administration are concerned. That there is a move and a movement to prescribe or attempt to prescribe sort of an organizational element of a group like Antifa and the complexity that you outline as well as you do, and not groups like Proud Boys, or indeed, I mean, people have sort of drawn parallels and comparisons between the effort to do that and the pardoning of people who were engaging in an insurrection on the Capitol in 2021.
I've heard those comparisons. I'm not here as a representative of the U.S. government, so that's a political debate that I never put forth the particular argument that you just outlaid. I can understand that argument. What is different, though, is that here else, my point is not so much that I think in these type of debates that I might have with liberals is that they always go, well, what about this group on the right or this side on the right? And they bring up either historical examples of violence or more recent ones. And they get really uncomfortable when I bring up examples of political violence on the left. And there's been some research showing that there's been a surge of it in recent years in the United States, particularly with far left militant groups encouraging the embrace of stockpiling firearms and training for anti-government violence. When I bring up the examples of Antifa violence, the violence that I've faced by them myself, there's
Hmm.
just a complete denial. So this is
Hmm.
not about who's worse than who. That's not my role here as a journalist. My role is that there's this whole aspect, one half of the story that's been systematically ignored by liberal media, ignored by
Okay.
Democrats, because
Yeah.
quite often Democrats benefit when Antifa act as their shock troops of violence on the
Okay.
streets of
Okay.
American cities.
Okay, I hear that. Perhaps just a sort of more direct point, though, to you, Andy, would be that you're obviously sort of advising to a degree the president. Somebody who endorsed what turned out to be a lie in 2020 that he'd won the election, whose supporters engaged in a violent effort to then overthrow it on the 6th of January. The accusation to you, I guess, is that you are engaging with somebody in a group of people who are in the same pursuit as the people that you are trying to expose as Antifa. Does that make sense?
Uh, I don't quite understand the question. You're saying that
Well,
I
January 6th insurrectionists attempted to use violence to overthrow democracy. And the central argument in your book and the central argument you make is that there are Antifa protesters, antagonists, terrorists who are using violence to overthrow democracy. Not so much whataboutery, but the fact that you are engaging with one group and criticizing another is the argument.
Actually, I've been very consistent in my criticisms of groups that use political violence. I have never defended the actions of those who engage in rioting on the 6th of January. And you, the reason why I
But
bring up,
is there a hypocrisy in advising Donald Trump when Donald Trump pardoned those people who'd
no,
engaged in
no,
these
sir,
riots?
please let me explain. It's because we've had now a decade of a movement that in the United States that's engaged in killings, in occupations of cities, taking over cities blocks, like what happened in Seattle in 2020, um, doing millions, if not billions, of damage to the economy. And we can't even get past the first step of even admitting that exists. I mean, a lot of the questions that you're asking me now is like, well, are they even organized? And, what about 6th of January? Can we get past that? You know, I'm my expertise is in Antifa, so my advisory role is on what I know and what I've seen and
Hmm.
what's been documented on the videos. And I just how many more people have to die, how many more businesses have to be set on fire, how much more looting needs to happen, and how many more people need to be injured and journalists targeted and beaten for us to even get to discussion, hey, there's a problem. And my frustration is this is always getting back to, at least in discussions with liberals or those who are on the center left, is well, basically, who's more bad than who? And can we just
But
admit that there's an issue of political violence in the U.S. that exists both in the
yeah,
far left
and I
and the
must say,
far right?
I must say, I don't care so much about that because I think that's a fair argument, and I think when people engage in whataboutery, then nobody wins, do they? And it's less about that, perhaps more about a hypocrisy that exists in those people who are critical of Antifa but willing to endorse and advise another group of people who are arguably in the same pursuit, which is a sort of which is an erosion of democracy by violence or otherwise.
I
Um,
completely disagree with that. I don't think that the current U.S. administration is about using political violence to achieve its aims. It
okay,
was a democratically elected president that we have, and those
okay.
who have been appointed in his cabinet were done through the correct processes.
Okay, okay. Just I've just a few more challenges, and I'd like to talk to you about the sort of wider context. But a few more challenges, if you'll allow, Andy, and I appreciate you taking them because one of the sort of criticisms that you get often is that you are or have been selective with the stories that you share. People often refer to an example, don't they, in 2019, where there was a video that was recorded. Somebody who'd gone undercover, an anti-fascist, possibly a member of Antifa, had gone undercover into the right-wing Christian nationalist group Patriot Prayer, an organisation that you'd sort of embedded yourself with to try to sort of follow this story. They said that you had witnessed a plan to instigate violence at a left-wing gathering on their part and didn't report it. And the accusation they make there is that there is a sort of selective nature to your journalism. How do you sort of answer that charge?
Yeah, so that was a very vicious lie that was put out by Rose City Antifa and their allies and comrades to try to delegitimize my work. The person who's recording on behalf of Rose City Antifa recorded, I believe, about 18 minutes of video, which is on YouTube. And I would um, ask you and anybody listening, if you're curious about the truth of that, go watch that story and come back and email me. My website's andy-ngo.com and let me know at which parts do you see that I so-called witnessed any type of criminal conspiracies. I didn't.
Okay.
I maintained that day that I was reporting on, it was May Day activities. There were different groups that had gathered in Portland, and Patriot Prayer was one of them. And I was following
Okay.
them from a distance with, by the way, another group of journalists. None of us had any idea where they were going. We followed them to see if anything would happen. And when they got outside a pub where Rose City Antifa was having an event, a journalist, the three of us got out our cameras and we started recording. At least two of us were subjected to violence. Myself that day, I was sprayed in the face with bear mace by the Rose City Antifa, who were all prepared with weapons, and the other student journalist was beaten up and had his camera smashed.
Okay.
So
So, yeah.
what's really important is not just, okay, excuse me, sir. When journalists work and put themselves in danger to expose Antifa, they are subjected to lies, smears, and violence. That is the MO of Antifa, and it's not just conservative journalists like myself who have been subjected to that. Even those who work in liberal and legacy media as well, they just stay quiet about it because they don't want to become a further target.
Right. Okay. And the second sort of argument that I'd like to put to you as well is, I mean, you talk about and you reference some of those who have been encouraged to violence. for which there is no justification or excuse, is there? And I'm curious how you sort of feel and reflect on the story of 2022 when an individual who was a subscriber to your YouTube channel, who sort of engaged with your content, went to a rally that you had sort of promoted and or you sort of you kind of talked about, and took a gun and opened fire. And a lot of people have sort of brought that back to your door effectively, haven't they, Andy, and said, look, for one way or another, you had perhaps encouraged that person there, or they'd at least engaged with your content and then went to do that.
So I see you're
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
going through a list of the Antifa smears about me. First
But
of
that
all, I
that did
haven't.
happen. With respect though, Andy, that did happen, didn't it?
Well, actually, no, not as you explained. First of all, I have no idea if this individual was one of 150,000 followers that I had at that time on YouTube. People can go to my YouTube channel. It's me posting my interviews that I've done on places like CNN and Fox News and conservative news sites. To make a suggestion that because somebody followed me on YouTube, that therefore they were inspired to violence against Antifa, is a complete lie. And I would argue it's defamatory. This individual was somebody who lived in the neighborhood that had been occupied that night by an armed, violent BLM Antifa type of group, a group that regularly engaged in violence in Portland, by the way. It's called Justice for Patrick Kimmons. This is an armed group. And there was a confrontation that occurred. And what happened next was horrific and tragic in that this individual fired upon the crowd, killing one woman. The crowd was also armed with a rifle, shot this man back. And what happened next is there was full investigation, and he was convicted at trial of the murder of that woman and for the attempted murders of the others. I have always maintained very clear that I reject political violence. That's the point of my work. So to make the suggestion that this individual was inspired of violence because of my work is repeating the same type of Antifa lies that have inspired some of them to try to kill me, sir.
Okay, but that's
It's not just
a fair point.
okay. Like get the points right because when you repeat these
With
lies,
respect,
sir,
with respect,
it
Andy,
puts more of a
it's a well.
target on me.
I accept that, Andy. But as it is a well documented story, and I asked you really not to necessarily justify it, but I was keen to know how you felt about that accusation, as opposed to asking you to sort of answer the accusation as much as anything else. I take the point, and you make your point articulately.
It's a
I,
disgusting smear.
that's the way you feel about it. Yeah.
It's
That's
not just
that's
how I feel. It's because the accusations do not line up with the facts, sir. You know, how many hundreds of thousands or millions of followers are there on any of the social media accounts across the times? Have you did a systematic review of any of the crimes maybe one or two or some individuals who follow your social media may have done over the years? And how, and then do you think it would be fair for somebody to come out and say because they followed you on your social media that somehow they were inspired towards whatever criminal act? Like, think about it logically through, you know? I have 1.8 million followers on my Twitter. I have no idea who 1.8 million people of these are. I'm responsible for what I say, my own actions, and what I do. And my writings from the beginning to end have always been very consistent. Is it's about honesty and also for the purpose of defending people's civil rights, which is that, and they're being violated day in and day out in the United States by individuals who declare themselves to be anti-fascist, but the question that nobody asks is, what are they being anti-fascist in furtherance of? And if you read their ideology, it's for an anti-government agenda. It's for a violent anarchist communist revolution.
and you, as you say, as you referenced earlier, you've been advising Donald Trump. You were I watched with interest a round table that you had done with him, where you talked to him about your stories. He also said that he'd watched a lot of your stuff. Um, what is it like? What is it sort of like being in Donald Trump's orbit?
The event was about 1 hour. The experience is something that I'm deeply grateful for. In that that day, the administration was finishing its negotiations with Hamas and the government of Israel about the ceasefire. So I'm deeply appreciative that as busy as the US administration was that it had myself and 7 other citizen journalists talk about our experiences reporting on this violent phenomenon in the US. And all of us were treated with respect and courtesy. And I felt that the um, interest from the administration was sincere, that it wasn't just a moment for the cameras or for as a talking point for conservatives.
Mm. Um, just briefly on this, but I am keen to get your take on it because I do find it fascinating. And you know, one of the things that you sort of talk about a lot in your work is attacks on democracy. And you know, it's a fascinating moment of history, isn't it? Really, for democracy and the defence of democracy, from all sides, really, isn't it? Left and right, the sort of all of the extremes who have democracy in their sights. We had a poll here in the United Kingdom that we considered on Times Radio just a few months ago of Gen Z. 52% of them saying that they thought that the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections. There was also another really striking stat, which is 47% agreed that the entire way our society is organised must be radically changed through revolution, right? Which is, you know, which is quite extraordinary. Those are large numbers of the next generation who just don't believe in democracy and believe in a revolution as a way to upend it, right? Which is, you know, I think it's very, very striking, and I think it's worth us taking pause to consider. Given your sort of work and how much you've thought about that, why do you think that idea is appears to be growing as rapidly as it is?
Um, I think young people are not well educated on history, and they are looking at their circumstances from a very myopic and narrow time frame. There are elections outcomes that they may disagree with, and they take in extremist ideas either through the universities or what they consume online, and find it appealing that our system, this is the lie that's being repeated, that the so-called system doesn't work. And not just that it doesn't work, and that we need to work harder on getting people who we want representing our views or our policy goals elected, but rather the whole thing needs to be abolished. I mean, my reporting hasn't just been on Antifa, but also the BLM movement and the lies that they were able to mainstream and perpetuate, that the US was actually something that couldn't even be salvageable, that from its inception to today, every aspect of all of its institutions were illegitimate because of systematic racism. And
Right.
so when you feed those type of lies and poisons into the minds of people and encourage them to take violent direct action, and oftentimes they are rewarded when they take those types of violent actions, such as rioting across the US where very few people were held accountable. It creates this environment where people are feeling more comfortable and emboldened to turning more and more to so-called violent direct action. And they never really seem to think about, well, what happens next when you create, let's say that they do achieve some type of revolution, lofty goal, what happens next? I mean,
Mhm.
in the specific case of Antifa, they had a run at that experiment a bit, one could argue. In
Okay.
fact, in 2020, they took over 6 city streets in the middle of Seattle. I went there and I covered the issue for myself because it seemed quite unbelievable that the city would pull out law enforcement and cede public property to violent militants. And a hard border was set up. They actually considered it a new autonomous territory. That was their term for it, autonomous zone. And they had border guards with firearms guarding and checking people who were going in and out. In the 3 weeks of that experimentation, what happened is that people were shot, people died, including a child, by the way. There were shootings every night, there were arson attacks, vandalism everywhere, reports of sex crimes. And the people who were drawn there were thugs and criminals and other individuals who styled themselves as warlords. So, in the absence of the rule of law, in the absence of governance, you have violence and terror. So that's, I mean, that's the what I'm trying to warn people about my reporting in Antifa is that
Sure.
they have these things that they say they try to fight for, and when they're actually given an opportunity to enact it, what it causes only is immense harm, particularly to the people that they claim they try to protect, black people,
Sure.
brown people.
And just very very briefly and finally, it's a compelling point you make, isn't it, about the idea that that the system isn't as broken as is sort of presented, and I wonder if the thing that I sort of come down to is perhaps something just a little bit more kind of basic and fundamental, which is that particularly in the United Kingdom, it's hard to get a house and everything costs a bit more, and university education is quite expensive these days, and wages have been stagnant and hard to get a doctor's appointment, and there are things that are a bit just away from the sort of extremes and the sort of more kind of radical end of it. There is just a sort of expensive friction that people are experiencing in life at the moment, which perhaps leads them on a pathway to the extremes. Is that something that we sort of got to take more seriously?
I think that's something that governments across the world have to recognize with, and that this this delicate system that's in practice in Western liberal democracies is it's not it's not it's not like it can't be attacked and perfect, and it's not seen as perfected. There are imperfections here and there, and it's up to those in government to make sure that the people's basic needs are being met. And if it's not, over time, their people's trust in the systems is going to go down, and it's obviously very dangerous, but it can lead to just the whole entire system being destabilized. And with some of the data you mentioned regarding the polling, it seems to be moving in that direction, and that's really scary.
Okay, Andy Ngo, thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you for taking the challenges. I know they are personal and deeply emotive for you, and I don't take lightly that you have taken them and that you've articulated a response. I hope you appreciate. It was never my intention to accuse you of anything. Just to present these to you to get your take on them, and you've articulated your response, and I appreciate that hugely. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll speak again.
Thanks for having me on.